Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a wild 1963 news report that still raises eyebrows. Harlem legend Bumpy Johnson secretly helped three men escape from Alcatraz. Sounds impossible, right? Stick with me as we separate myth from documented facts using verified records, timelines, and first-hand reports. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and please subscribe because a lot of real work goes into tracking down true data, cross-checking sources, and cutting through rumors so you get facts, not hype. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson was far more than a neighborhood gangster. He was a complex power broker who operated at the intersection of crime, politics, and community life in Harlem. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Johnson earned his nickname from a noticeable bump on the back of his head. He moved to Harlem during the Great Migration, a period when Black Americans were reshaping northern cities, and he quickly learned how power actually worked on the streets through alliances, fear, money, and reputation. By the 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had risen to prominence under the notorious Madame Stephanie St. Clair, a powerful numbers queen who ran Harlem's illegal lottery operations. Under her mentorship, Johnson learned discipline, strategy, and the importance of public image. When Dutch Schultz, a violent white mobster, attempted to seize control of Harlem's numbers racket, Johnson became a central figure in the resistance, helping push Schultz out through a mix of street pressure and political maneuvering. What truly set Bumpy Johnson apart from other crime figures was his relationship with the Italian mafia, particularly Lucky Luciano. Johnson negotiated an unprecedented arrangement that allowed black criminal organizations to operate with a degree of autonomy while still paying tribute. This made him one of the few black men in mid-20th century America to wield real influence across racial lines in organized crime, earning both respect and suspicion from law enforcement. Despite his criminal activities, Johnson cultivated an image as a community protector. Many Harlem residents viewed him as a Robin Hood figure because he reportedly paid rent for struggling families, funded education for local kids, and protected businesses from random violence. This dual image, ruthless enforcer and neighborhood benefactor, made him a legend and complicated how history remembers him. Johnson was also known for his intellect, which challenged stereotypes about mobsters. He enjoyed reading philosophy, writing poetry, and engaging in deep conversation. Prison guards and journalists alike remarked on his calm demeanor and sharp mind. This intellectual reputation fed later myths that portrayed him as a mastermind capable of orchestrating elaborate operations far beyond the streets of Harlem. Law enforcement, however, saw him differently. To the FBI and local police, Bumpy Johnson was a high-level criminal figure who skillfully avoided long sentences by using connections, silence, and legal savvy. He spent years in and out of prison, but rarely lost control of his influence. Even behind bars, rumors circulated that he maintained communication channels and loyalty networks. By the early 1960s, when the Alcatraz escape story emerged, Bumpy Johnson was already a larger-than-life figure. His name alone carried weight, mystery, and fear, making it easy for sensational claims to attach themselves to him. Whether or not he had any connection to Alcatraz, understanding who Bumpy Johnson really was, explains why people believed he could, because he symbolized hidden power operating behind America's most rigid systems. Alcatraz was considered escape-proof because of where it sat, isolated on a cold, rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The prison was surrounded by strong, unpredictable currents and freezing water temperatures that could drop below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Officials believed that even if an inmate managed to leave the island, the bay itself would finish the job before they ever reached shore. The prison's design reinforced that belief. Alcatraz was built with solid concrete walls, narrow corridors, and steel barred cells that were far more secure than those in most federal prisons of the time. Every movement inside the facility was controlled, from meal times to work assignments, leaving little opportunity for unsupervised activity. Guards had clear sight lines across cell blocks, and inmate counts were frequent and strict. Security routines were relentless. Prisoners were counted up to 12 times a day, including surprise counts at night. Lights were shined directly into cells after bedtime to ensure inmates were present. Any irregularity, no matter how small, triggered immediate investigation. This constant monitoring made the idea of a long-term escape plan seem unrealistic to authorities. Another major deterrent was psychological. Alcatraz housed inmates considered the most dangerous, disruptive, or escape-prone from other prisons. Many were already serving long or life sentences, and the strict conditions were meant to break escape ambitions rather than encourage them. Silence rules, limited privileges, and isolation cells created an atmosphere of control and intimidation. The natural environment added another layer of defense. Officials emphasized the presence of sharks in the bay, even though most were harmless species. This fear tactic worked, reinforcing the idea that the waters were deadly, combined with rough winds and fog that often reduced visibility. The bay appeared unforgiving and impossible to navigate without proper equipment. Alcatraz also lacked many of the resources inmates might exploit elsewhere. There were no trees for tools, no loose soil for tunnels, and limited access to materials. Anything that could be used for escape, spoons, scraps, wires, was tightly regulated. The island's isolation meant that even missing items were quickly noticed. Because of all this, Alcatraz developed a reputation not just as a prison, but as the final stop, the place you couldn't beat. This reputation was so strong that officials confidently claimed no inmate could ever escape alive. That belief made later escape attempts, especially those rumored to succeed, all the more shocking and controversial. The Alcatraz escape timeline that feeds into the 1962-1963 conversation begins years before the famous breakout, with small but important warning signs that the prison's security was not as flawless as officials claimed. Throughout the 1950s, inmates quietly tested the system, probing guard routines, noting weaknesses in cell structures, and observing how sound and movement traveled through the cell house. While most attempts failed quickly, they revealed that Alcatraz was vulnerable in ways the public never heard about. By late 1961, 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, began carefully studying their cells in the B block. They noticed that the ventilation grills beneath their sinks were badly eroded by years of salty air and moisture. Using makeshift tools like spoons stolen from the dining hall, they slowly chipped away at the concrete over several months, working only during music hour when noise from the prison accordion masked their efforts. In early 1962, the plan accelerated. The men created a hidden workshop in the unused top tier of the cell house, where they assembled crude tools and stitched together a raft using stolen raincoats. The raincoats were heat-sealed with steam pipes, forming an improvised inflatable boat and life vests, an idea so unlikely that guards never imagined it could work. Every step of the plan relied on patience, timing, and the assumption that no outside help was available. On the night of June 11, 1962, the escape was put into motion. The men placed dummy heads made from soap, toilet paper, and toothpaste in their beds, topped with real human hair collected from the prison barber shop. These decoys fooled guards during nighttime flashlight checks. After lights out, they climbed through the enlarged vent holes, scaled the plumbing pipes, and reached the cell house roof undetected. Shortly after 11:30 p.m., the men launched their raft from the northeast shore of the island, aiming toward Angel Island. By morning, were gone. When guards discovered the escape during the 7 a.m. count on June 12th, Alcatraz was immediately locked down. Massive search involving the FBI, Coast Guard, and local police began, focusing on the bay and surrounding shoreline. In the weeks that followed, fragments of the raft and bits of personal belongings were found floating in the water, reinforcing the official belief that the men had drowned. However, no bodies were ever recovered. Conflicting tidal analysis suggested that survival was at least possible, reopening questions about whether the escape succeeded and how far the men might have gone. By 1963, the escape had evolved from a prison incident into a national mystery. Media coverage, rumors, and speculation filled the gap left by the lack of definitive proof. It was during this period that stories began to emerge linking powerful underworld figures to the escape, claims fueled by the idea that such a complex operation might have required help beyond the prison walls, setting the stage for legends that continue to circulate decades later. The media storm surrounding the Alcatraz escape began almost immediately after the breakout was discovered in June 1962, but it intensified through 1963 as uncertainty replaced official certainty. Early newspaper reports focused on the apparent brilliance of the escape plan, highlighting how 3 inmates managed to outsmart what was widely considered the most secure prison in America. Headlines emphasized embarrassment for federal authorities, which created fertile ground for speculation and exaggeration. As weeks passed with no bodies recovered, journalists began questioning the FBI's conclusion that the men had drowned. Several newspapers published conflicting expert opinions about San Francisco Bay currents, with some arguing that the tides on the night of the escape could have carried the men safely toward land. This disagreement between experts was heavily reported, giving the public reason to doubt official statements and believe survival was possible. By late 1962, tabloids and syndicated crime columns took the story further, suggesting that an escape of this complexity could not have been executed without outside assistance. These articles often relied on unnamed sources or vague underworld insiders, a common journalistic practice at the time. It was in this environment that famous criminal names began appearing in print not as proven facts, but as tantalizing possibilities. In 1963, some reports began linking the escape to organized crime figures using language carefully framed to avoid legal liability. Phrases like rumored connections and alleged backing appeared frequently. Bumpy Johnson's name surfaced in this context, largely because of his reputation for influence and his mythic status in both Harlem and the broader criminal world. Importantly, these stories rarely cited documents, witnesses, or law enforcement confirmation. Radio talk shows and crime magazines amplified these claims even further. Hosts and writers speculated openly, blending verified details with conjecture to keep audiences engaged. The lack of new official information allowed rumors to circulate unchecked, and repetition gave those rumors a sense of legitimacy, even when no evidence supported them. Law enforcement agencies publicly dismissed the media speculation, reiterating that the escapees most likely drowned. However, their refusal to release certain investigative details, standard practice for ongoing cases, only fueled suspicion. To many readers, silence from authorities suggested hidden truths rather than procedural caution. By the end of 1963, the Alcatraz escape had shifted from a news event to a cultural mystery. Media coverage played a central role in that transformation, turning unanswered questions into lasting legends. While no credible evidence ever confirmed outside criminal involvement, the way the story was reported ensured that speculation, especially involving famous figures, would become permanently embedded in the public imagination. Bumpy Johnson's influence was widely believed to extend far beyond the streets of Harlem, largely because of the networks he built over decades in organized crime. By the 1940s and 1950s, Harlem was no longer isolated from the national criminal underworld. It was connected through money, politics, and mutual interests. Johnson sat at the center of those connections, acting as a bridge between black-run operations in New York and larger syndicates operating across the country. One of the most significant factors behind this reach was his working relationship with the Italian mafia, particularly figures associated with Lucky Luciano's organization. Unlike many crime bosses who relied solely on violence, Johnson relied on negotiation and structure. This allowed him to conduct business that crossed state lines, including gambling revenues, protection arrangements, and dispute mediation, all of which required constant communication beyond Harlem. Johnson's repeated incarcerations also expanded his reach rather than limiting it. Federal prisons during that era housed high-ranking criminals from across the United States, creating an environment where influence traveled through conversation, favors, and reputation. Johnson was known to interact with inmates from different regions, reinforcing his name as someone with authority and connections, even behind bars. Rumors of Johnson's national influence were amplified by how rarely he was directly challenged. When disputes arose involving Harlem interests, they were often resolved quietly, without open conflict. To outsiders, this calm suggested unseen power operating in the background. Over time, this perception evolved into belief that Johnson could make things happen without being physically present. Law enforcement agencies were aware of Johnson's broader connections, even if they couldn't always prove them in court. Surveillance files and informant reports described him as a figure who understood the structure of organized crime beyond local boundaries. However, much of this information remained classified or incomplete, leaving room for speculation to fill the gaps. This reputation for reach made Johnson a convenient name to attach to extraordinary events. When something appeared too complex or too successful to be handled by ordinary criminals, his name naturally surfaced in rumors. It wasn't necessarily because of evidence, but because his legend fit the narrative of hidden coordination and influence. By the early 1960s, Bumpy Johnson had become more than a man. He was a symbol of unseen power operating beyond public view. That symbolic status explains why stories like the Alcatraz escape drew his name into the conversation. Whether involved or not, his perceived reach beyond Harlem made him believable in the public imagination as someone capable of influencing events far from New York City. Claims about alleged financial backing in the Alcatraz escape story emerged mainly because of how expensive and complex a successful escape would have been, least in the public imagination. Commentators in the early 1960s argued that assembling tools, coordinating timing, and surviving after reaching land would require money and planning beyond what prisoners could manage on their own. This assumption opened the door to speculation about outside funding, even though no direct evidence supported it. Supporters of the financial backing theory often pointed to the idea that escaped inmates would need resources waiting for them: cash, clothing, transportation, or safe houses. In a period when organized crime figures were believed to have access to all of these things, it became easy for writers and rumor mongers to suggest that someone powerful must have helped bankroll the operation. These claims were usually framed as possible explanations rather than proven facts. Bumpy Johnson's name entered this conversation largely because of his reputation for controlling money flows in Harlem's underground economy. He was known to manage large sums through gambling operations and protection networks, which made him a believable candidate in the eyes of the public. However, none of the claims ever explained why he would financially support inmates he had no documented connection to. Importantly, no prison records, financial trails, or witness testimony ever indicated that money was transferred to or from the escapees. Alcatraz inmates had limited access to cash, and their communications were heavily monitored. Even the materials used in the escape, spoons, raincoats, soap, were prison-issued or stolen, undermining the idea that outside money played a role in the preparation itself. Law enforcement agencies investigated the possibility of external assistance as part of standard procedure. BI files from the era focused on tides, debris recovery, and known associates of the escapees, not financial sponsors. The absence of financial evidence was one of the reasons officials consistently rejected claims of organized crime involvement. Despite this, the financial backing theory persisted because it filled a psychological gap. For many people, it was easier to believe that money and power beat Alcatraz than patience and ingenuity. The myth of hidden funding made the story feel more dramatic and aligned with popular beliefs about how the criminal underworld operated. Over time, these unproven claims became part of the larger legend rather than the historical record. They reflect more about public fascination with powerful figures like Bumpy Johnson than about what actually happened. In the end, alleged financial backing remains speculation, repeated often, proven never, and sustained mainly by the mystery surrounding the escape itself. From the perspective of federal authorities, the Alcatraz escape was treated as a prison failure, not a criminal conspiracy. FBI and Bureau of Prisons focused first on physical evidence, cell damage, missing materials, and environmental factors, rather than outside masterminds. Their initial assumption was straightforward. 3 inmates exploited structural weaknesses and attempted a dangerous escape that likely ended in drowning. Throughout 1962 and into 1963, investigators analyzed tide patterns, water temperatures, and debris recovered from the bay. Their conclusion leaned heavily on environmental probability. Officials believed that the cold water, strong currents, and distance to shore made survival extremely unlikely. This scientific framing allowed law enforcement to close the case without expanding it into a wider criminal investigation. When rumors of organized crime involvement began appearing in the media, agencies publicly downplayed them. FBI statements emphasized that there was no evidence linking the escapees to external criminal figures, financially or otherwise. Internally, files from the period show a focus on known associates of the inmates themselves, not on high-profile crime bosses with no direct connection. Bumpy Johnson's name, when it surfaced in press speculation, was not supported by law enforcement documentation. No wiretaps, informant reports, or surveillance records tied him to the escape. From the FBI's standpoint, attaching a famous underworld figure to the event was a distraction fueled by reputation rather than evidence. Authorities were also wary of validating speculation because it risked undermining public confidence. Acknowledging that a powerful crime figure could influence an escape from the most secure prison in America would have raised serious concerns about institutional control. As a result, officials maintained a narrow, evidence-based narrative and avoided engaging with rumor-driven theories. Behind the scenes, standard protocol required investigators to consider all possibilities, including outside help. However, those avenues were quietly closed when no supporting facts emerged. The absence of phone records, financial transfers, coded correspondence, or visitor irregularities made further pursuit unnecessary in the eyes of federal agents. Ultimately, the law enforcement position remained consistent for decades. The escape was an internal operation carried out by inmates using ingenuity and patience, not outside orchestration. While myths continued to grow in popular culture, the official stance never shifted. For authorities, the case was a lesson in prison design failure, not proof of hidden criminal control reaching into Alcatraz. Prison security loopholes at Alcatraz were subtle but crucial in allowing the 1962 escape to succeed, despite the prison's reputation as escape-proof. While the facility's design emphasized isolation and control, years of wear, environmental damage, and human oversight created small vulnerabilities that clever inmates could exploit. These weaknesses were often overlooked by authorities who trusted in the island's natural and structural defenses. One of the most significant loopholes involved the ventilation system in the B block, where Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were housed. The steel grills covering the vents were corroded from years of exposure to salty air and moisture, making it possible for inmates to enlarge the openings without immediate detection. Prisoners were assigned maintenance duties that gave them limited access to tools, further enabling discreet modifications. Another vulnerability lay in guard routines. While daily counts were rigorous, they were predictable. Lights were checked at set times. Guards followed similar patrol routes. The escapees studied these schedules meticulously, timing their activities to coincide with distractions such as music hours or meal times, which masked the noise of their work. The system assumed compliance rather than constant ingenuity, creating exploitable gaps. Alcatraz's strict segregation of inmates also had an unintended consequence. Because prisoners were confined to their blocks for long stretches, guards assumed there was little opportunity for collaboration or planning. However, this isolation actually allowed Morris and the Anglins to work in secret within the confines of their cells, gradually preparing their escape without raising suspicion. The prison underestimated the creativity that long-term confinement could inspire. Tools themselves became a loophole. The escapees used everyday items, spoons, stolen drill bits, and even soap and toothpaste to modify their cells and create dummy heads. These objects were considered benign and were not carefully monitored, which allowed prisoners to repurpose them without triggering alarms. Small misjudgments in oversight turned ordinary items into instruments of escape. The architectural layout of Alcatraz contributed as well. The plumbing and structural beams provided hidden climbing routes, and access points to the roof were not as secure as authorities believed. Combining knowledge of the building's layout with improvised tools, the inmates could navigate from their cells to the roof and eventually to the shore. These physical gaps were overlooked because the prison relied on reputation and routine rather than continuous reevaluation. Finally, communication gaps within the prison staff created additional weaknesses. Shift changes, understaffed sections, and inconsistent reporting meant that minor anomalies were often dismissed. For example, guards sometimes assumed noise came from routine activities or other prisoners. These small lapses, combined with environmental and structural vulnerabilities, created a network of loopholes that Morris and the Anglins exploited to make the most daring escape in Alcatraz history. Conflicting witness statements added another layer of mystery to the Alcatraz escape, making it difficult for authorities and historians to separate fact from speculation. From the moment the escape was discovered, inmates, guards, and visitors provided accounts that often contradicted one another, fueling uncertainty about what really happened that night. Each perspective reflected personal biases, fear of retaliation, or imperfect memory, which left investigators with a fragmented narrative. Some prisoners claimed to have seen the escapees working on the ventilation holes weeks before the breakout, while others insisted that no unusual activity occurred. This divide among inmates made it hard to determine whether the preparation had been visible to anyone or if the escapees had operated entirely in secret. The conflicting testimonies also raised questions about whether additional inmates or outside contacts were involved. Guards' statements added to the confusion. Some recalled noticing minor irregularities, such as unusual noises or items out of place. Many admitted they assumed these were routine prisoner antics rather than signs of a serious escape plan. Others insisted that everything seemed normal during evening rounds, suggesting either inattentiveness or skillful deception by the escapees. These divergent accounts created a situation where multiple interpretations of the same events seemed plausible. Even witnesses from outside the prison contributed contradictions. Fishermen and boaters in the bay reported seeing small, unidentifiable objects in the water, but their reports varied widely on timing, location, and the size of the objects. Some claimed the escapees might have survived. Others were confident the debris suggested drowning. The inconsistency of these external accounts made it impossible to draw definitive conclusions about the escape's outcome. Family members of the inmates also added a layer of conflicting testimony. Some reported receiving letters or hearing second-hand stories that implied the escapees had survived and reached safety, while others had no such communication. Over time, these claims were amplified in the media, blurring the line between rumor and potential evidence. Even decades later, conflicting statements continued to emerge from people claiming inside knowledge or connections to the escape. Some said they had seen the escapees in different parts of the country. Others insisted they had died in the bay. Without corroborating evidence, each claim fueled speculation rather than clarity. Ultimately, the contradictions in witness statements created a vacuum that allowed myths to thrive. The inconsistencies made it nearly impossible to establish a single, verifiable sequence of events, which is why the Alcatraz escape remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. These conflicting perspectives not only challenged investigators at the time, but also shaped the enduring legend surrounding the breakout. Official records from the Alcatraz escape provide the clearest anchor in a story clouded by rumors, speculation, and sensational media reports. The Bureau of Prisons, FBI, and Coast Guard compiled detailed logs, surveillance reports, and investigative files that documented the escape from start to finish. These records confirm the basic facts: 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, disappeared from their cells on the night of June 11, 1962, leaving behind cell modifications and makeshift dummy heads to deceive the guards. The prison's internal reports outlined how the escape was discovered during the morning count. Alarms were triggered when the dummy heads were found, and a thorough sweep of the cells revealed enlarged ventilation holes that the inmates had painstakingly created over several months. These reports provide clear evidence that the breakout was entirely internal and planned by the inmates themselves, using patience, observation, and ingenuity rather than external orchestration. FBI files from the investigation detail the efforts to recover the escapees, including water searches, interviews with local fishermen, and analysis of tides and debris. The official conclusion, based on environmental factors, was that the men likely drowned in the bay. These files also include maps of currents, weather reports, and testimonies from law enforcement officers, showing a methodical, evidence-based approach to the case rather than reliance on rumor or speculation. Financial records and correspondence examined by federal authorities revealed no evidence of outside funding or involvement from organized crime figures like Bumpy Johnson. While sensational accounts suggested external backing, the official documentation confirms that the escape was carried out using materials already available inside the prison: raincoats, spoons, other mundane items. There was simply no paper trail linking the inmates to outside financial support. Visitor logs, phone records, and prison communications were also reviewed as part of the investigation. Nothing indicated that any associates or criminal contacts had provided instructions or supplies. These official checks helped reinforce the conclusion that the escape was self-contained, relying solely on the inmates' creativity, timing, and careful exploitation of minor structural weaknesses in Alcatraz. Even years later, when public fascination with the escape led to conspiracy theories, historians and investigators have continually referenced these official records, court documents, interviews with former guards, and FBI declassified files all align in showing that there was no verifiable evidence of outside orchestration. The official narrative, grounded in tangible records, provides the most reliable account amidst decades of speculation. Ultimately, the official records confirm that while the Alcatraz escape remains mysterious in terms of whether the men survived, it was meticulously planned and executed internally. No evidence has ever linked Bumpy Johnson or any other organized crime figure to the operation. These records remain the benchmark for separating documented fact from legend, showing that the breakout was a testament to inmate ingenuity rather than outside intervention. The aspects of the Alcatraz escape that remain unproven or speculative are largely what keep the story alive in public imagination. The most enduring question is whether Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers actually survived the treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay. Despite official conclusions suggesting they drowned, no bodies were ever recovered, leaving room for alternative theories and continued speculation decades later. Eyewitness reports and alleged sightings after the escape fuel speculation, but are inconsistent and often unverifiable. Some claimed to have seen the men on the West Coast, while others reported supposed encounters in other states. Yet none of these accounts were ever substantiated with concrete evidence like photographs, fingerprints, or verified documentation. The lack of verifiable proof keeps survival theories in the realm of speculation rather than fact. Stories linking Bumpy Johnson or other organized crime figures to the escape are also unproven. While his name appeared in media accounts as someone with potential influence or resources to assist, there is no documented evidence, financial records, prison communication logs, or witness testimony linking him to the escape. These claims remain speculative, based on reputation rather than factual connection. The effectiveness of the escape plan itself is sometimes debated. While official records confirm the physical mechanics of the breakout, questions remain about how the raft and life vests could have survived the cold, fast-moving bay waters. Experts analyzing tides and currents can only estimate probabilities. Whether the men actually navigated successfully remains unknown. Any claims beyond the documented actions inside the prison cannot be verified. Rumors of outside coordination, whether through corrupt officials, criminal contacts, or unknown collaborators, also remain unproven. Some narratives suggest that assistance came from beyond the prison walls, but there is no record in FBI or Bureau of Prisons files to substantiate these claims. The absence of evidence doesn't confirm involvement. It leaves space for speculation to thrive. Even decades later, letters, notes, or alleged confessions claiming to identify the escapees' survival lack independent verification. Researchers and historians continue to examine such claims, but none have met the standards required to be considered factual. Lack of verifiable proof means that these stories remain part of Alcatraz lore rather than historical record. Ultimately, the speculative elements of the Alcatraz escape, survival, outside involvement, and post-escape whereabouts, highlight the limits of historical certainty. While much of the planning, execution, and immediate aftermath is well documented, these unproven claims are what give the story its enduring mystique, blending fact, myth, and cultural fascination into one of the most famous prison legends in history. The legend of the Alcatraz escape has had a lasting impact on American culture, shaping how people perceive both the prison itself and the mythos surrounding criminals like Frank Morris, the Anglin brothers, and figures like Bumpy Johnson. While the facts of the breakout are documented, the story's endurance owes much to how myths filled the gaps left by uncertainty, sensationalized media, and conflicting reports. Over time, the narrative of Alcatraz transformed from a simple prison incident into a symbol of ingenuity, audacity, and mystery. One reason the legend persists is the dramatic contrast between the prison's reputation and the escape's execution. Alcatraz was advertised as escape-proof, isolated, and secure. The fact that 3 inmates could seemingly defy such security captured the public imagination and allowed the story to grow in ways that stretched beyond the actual historical record. This perceived improbability made legends of external masterminds like Bumpy Johnson plausible in the popular imagination. Movies, television shows, and books have further amplified the escape's mythos. Popular culture has emphasized drama, suspense, and speculation, often blurring the line between verified events and creative embellishment. Films like Escape from Alcatraz dramatized the breakout, while countless documentaries and articles explore conspiracy theories, rumored survival, and alleged outside involvement. These portrayals cemented the story as an iconic part of American criminal folklore. The legend also reflects societal fascination with clever underdogs and anti-heroes. The idea that ordinary prisoners could outwit a federal institution resonates with a cultural preference for stories of cunning, perseverance, and audacity. Bumpy Johnson's alleged connection adds another layer, appealing to the notion of powerful, unseen figures operating behind the scenes, a theme that recurs in tales of organized crime. Even law enforcement's role contributes to the legend. The inability to recover the bodies, combined with the careful documentation that leaves unanswered questions, has created a tension between certainty and mystery. This tension allows speculation to thrive while keeping the official records intact, reinforcing the idea that some elements of the escape may never be fully explained. The ongoing fascination with the escape also illustrates how public memory selects and emphasizes dramatic details over mundane facts. Stories of dummy heads, makeshift rafts, and daring climbs are highlighted, while the meticulous, patient work of planning inside the cells often receives less attention. This selective memory transforms a documented event into a narrative with mythic qualities. Ultimately, the legacy of the Alcatraz escape lies in its dual identity. It is both a well-documented prison breakout and a cultural legend that invites speculation. While history confirms the inmates' planning and disappearance, the enduring myths about survival, outside assistance, and figures like Bumpy Johnson ensure that the story remains a compelling part of American criminal history, balancing fact with the allure of the unknown.